Okay, welcome. So in this video, we are going to be talking about mental health during difficult times, and we're also going to be talking about integrative psychiatry and what that is. So I'm Dr. Nishi Bhopal. I'm a physician specializing in integrative psychiatry and sleep medicine, and I'm the founder of Pacific Integrative Psychiatry, an online mental health practice in California. And if you want to learn more about how to improve your mental health, then go ahead and subscribe to this channel. So I am delighted today to be joined by my friend and colleague, Dr. Tracy Peng. Dr. Tracy is an integrative psychiatrist, a specialist in combining conventional and complementary therapies as appropriate. And her special interests include mindfulness approaches to psychotherapy and the use of both Western and Eastern approaches to treat anxiety and depression. Welcome, Dr. Tracy.
Thank you. So good to be here.
I'm really delighted to have you. We both share this passion for integrative psychiatry and integrative mental health. And there's kind of this idea that integrative psychiatry is like a new paradigm in psychiatric treatment, but it's actually very old. It's based on ancient principles. And I just think of it as kind of like it's good psychiatry, like it's just good medicine. So could you share more about like how you got into integrative psychiatry and a bit about your work in this area?
Yeah, so I think it's about good humanhood, actually. And you're right, like a lot of the traditions like Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine have thousands of years behind them. But, I actually got into integrative psychiatry because I was suffering. I think that's pretty common for a lot of people. I started meditating maybe like 6 to 8 months before I started medical school. And it was more as a way to heal. It's not only kind of a way to heal, but it's also a way to grow. Different practices, meditation practices, energy practices, psychotherapy, depth work. It's all kind of trying to bring things into balance that have gotten out of balance or that have gotten traumatized and then kind of become concretized because of undigested trauma. So it really predated, even going into medical school. And then just as I made my way through the training, I got involved with Zen Hospice Project when I was a psychiatry resident and just really found that the mainstream of psychiatric medication plus a certain rigid model of psychodynamic psychotherapy just wasn't complete for me. It wasn't sort of a big enough picture. And didn't feel like fully healing to me or the people that I was surrounded by. So that's sort of how it started, and it's been really organic. And I have really learned a lot over the course of my career. It's been over 20 years now, and just as with experience, I've just become kind of wider and wider in sort of my capacity to in the perspective that I hold.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how a lot of us who do go into integrative psychiatry or integrative medicine in general, and how it stems from our own personal experiences. Mm-hmm. And like for me, it was something similar. I was really struggling, especially during residency, really burned out, just not sure that I was doing the right thing. Like it was a hard time, and there's just a lot of things that were going on at that time in my life. And that's actually when I discovered yoga and meditation. Like I had done some yoga before, yoga classes on weekends and that kind of thing, but nothing in a really transformative way. And those experiences kind of opened me up to seeing that there are other dimensions of life, there are other dimensions of health and healing and ways of being that we just were not even touching in psychiatric training. And so it's just interesting to hear your experience with that, because mine was kind of parallel. I think it's even more powerful like when we are bringing those personal experiences into our work with patients. Mm-hmm. Just more aligned and in integrity. Mm-hmm. When we can do it that way. So how does integrative psychiatry help with a lot of the stuff that's happening in the world right now? Like we're still going through this pandemic. At the time of this recording, there was this horrible school shooting that just happened. And, I'm hearing from my patients that they're just really struggling to grapple with everything that's going on in the world. And, so I'd love to hear your perspectives on that and how you personally deal with that, and maybe what you might recommend to some of your patients.
Yeah. These events, they're not easy. They're really heartbreaking. And I think it's important not to pretend that that's not the case, because it is. I think of myself as an integrative and holistic depth psychiatrist. And so to me, what that means is like a perspective, sort of like the 10,000 year perspective or the bird's eye perspective, where you can kind of, if you're flying over, land, you can kind of see where things might be out of balance. And you can kind of have ideas about how to bring things more into balance, potentially, if you're sort of holding that wider view. It doesn't mean that when you're down, in a specific, wildfire situation, that it's not horrible and traumatic and really tough. But something about being able to kind of see the big picture and rest in the big picture gives you more of a sense of what the options might be for becoming part of the solution to any given thing. And I think part of what happens when we hear about these horrific, violent events in the news is that there's an inundation of our nervous system with horrific events that we don't have any control over, that we don't have influence over. And they're also, they also operate on a collective level. They're individuals that carry them out, but they're collective forces that sort of predispose people or groups of people to doing these things. And so I think also I've been playing around with this idea of, what would it be like not to watch or listen to the news alone, but rather maybe like gather with a collective, once a week or every 2 weeks, and then kind of receive the information in a collective, because the traumas are so collective, and then how that might change the experience of it, which is kind of hard in COVID times because we're more isolated. You and I would probably be meeting live if we weren't, in a pandemic. And so there's a way in which the co-regulation, it's harder to reach when we're separated in these ways. But I think just, first of all, just letting the feelings kind of move through as much as possible, like digesting the information. And that takes slowing down, that takes not being inundated, like regulating like the amount of times, because the news diet of violence is, it's a toxic diet. And so you have to really titrate, like how often, how much am I going to take this in? And so there are just kind of multiple levels on which you can kind of regulate yourself individually and think about how might you regulate yourself collectively. And then, from that wisdom and that wider perspective, what action is obvious to be taken next. But I do feel like people tend to feel better when they're engaged in something that feels like the solution or feels like the rebalancing of something that's really out of balance.
Yeah, I think that's such a beautiful idea of even just simply not watching the news alone, like not consuming that stuff by yourself. And that feels very natural in a way, because I think, we're all very isolated right now because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, like loneliness is a public health issue.
Yeah.
Right. And like hundreds, thousands of years ago, we didn't live alone. Like we lived in communities. Yeah. And if we were receiving news or, grieving, it would be done collectively. And so there's almost something very unnatural about processing this on your own.
Yeah, that's why people gather for weddings and funerals and, because there's something about being in the collective that kind of helps ground it.
Right.
Information. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's also a really important point about just being really intentional about what you're consuming and how much and when and how, because our nervous systems are not designed to take in that much information. constantly all the time. And the news is curated to be sensational and to keep you watching and to keep you worried so that you keep, so that,
You're
so the
looking
cycle
for some
continues.
sort of, reassurance, and you're not going to get it there. Yeah.
Yeah.
When George Floyd was murdered in 2000 or 2020, it's funny because I just instinctually realized, like, I cannot watch this videotape by myself. But I didn't really have a place to go. And what I ended up doing was watching it on Red Table Talk, because then I could watch women of color and I felt like I was watching it with them. And then something about having my emotional reaction and their emotional reaction sort of regulated me in a way where I could tolerate the information, as horrific as it was. Like, it made it easier to digest.
That's really interesting, right? So like you're co-regulating, even though you're not with somebody else in person or even live, you're watching a recording of a conversation with other people, but that can still help you co-regulate, help you regulate your nervous system. And okay, so for people who are listening, if they're not familiar with this idea of regulation or co-regulation, can you explain what that is?
We were born knowing how to comfort each other as human beings. I mean, that's what mothers do with their infants. If you're lucky, if you're not lucky, maybe your mother couldn't do that. But the way that you might rock your child, or just kind of tell your partner about your bad day and then start to feel a little better, depending on the response of the person. Sometimes the person is like, I can't help you. I'm up to here. But, ideally, if you're talking to somebody who's grounded and kind of doing okay, there's a way in which we can lend our nervous systems to one another.
And that idea too, of what you were saying before, the idea of balance, of, when we're out of balance, it's harder to regulate. And so that's why co-regulation is really helpful, to have somebody, help you almost remember who you are. Like there's this idea in Ayurveda that illness happens because we've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten that we're part of this collective and we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And that's an unconscious forgetting. It's not like we've decided to forget or we're ignoring it necessarily, but there's like this unconscious forgetting that happens individually and on a collective level. And so when we can reconnect with that, that's when healing and balance can happen. So we've talked a lot about sleep just in our own conversations. And this idea of like, how can you sleep at night when all this stuff is happening in the world? There's even like consumerism and everything that's happening with the environment and politically, socially. I see a lot of patients who struggle with sleeping at night for various reasons. And part of it may be related to all this collective trauma that we're going through and processing together. So what's your take on that?
Nothing good comes out of violence to yourself, treating yourself poorly, right? Like just being like, yeah, I can't enjoy my life. I'm not allowed to. I'm too guilty. Like, why is my life so good? When other people are suffering, like that kind of unkindness to self or violence to self doesn't ever really lead anywhere good. So part of it is like, if I sleep well at night, it's a contribution to the health of the whole.
Yeah.
Right? If God forbid there be one more happy, well-rested person walking on the planet,
Yeah.
And who has that energy to give. So thinking that you're helping by keeping yourself suffering, just be kind to yourself. But then once you're feeling better, once you're doing a little better, don't lose touch with the fact that, you may have something to offer people that aren't feeling better yet and, or who are being really crushed by circumstances in a way that you aren't.
Right.
So and it's like that balance. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. And there is almost like an obligation to take care of yourself. I mean, that old cliche of like, you put your oxygen mask on first on the airplane, right? Because if you can't breathe, then you can't help anyone else around you. Yeah. And so there is almost like this moral obligation to take care of yourself,
forget this one.
Yeah. Because we're no different than anyone else, right? Like that's where this idea of like negative ego even can come in, where there's this false separation that like, oh, well, I don't deserve it. I don't deserve to take care of myself, or I feel guilty if I, allow myself to get more sleep, or if I prioritize my physical health or mental health, or eat good food because other people in other countries don't have good food, and there's that guilt that comes in. But actually, if you are not taking care of yourself fully with deep compassion, with genuine compassion, you cannot truly be compassionate to anybody else.
Yeah, it's really in direct proportion, unless you're a narcissist. But even narcissists aren't really like fully kindly caring for themselves, because
Right.
so there's a whole 360 kind of experience to compassion.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's because you have to have empathy to have compassion. And narcissists, I mean, that's one of the key features, right? They lack that aspect. But so self-compassion, I mean, for me, self-compassion was such a revolutionary idea because like we don't, like in my like I grew up in an Indian family, like self-compassion is not a thing, even though it's rooted in Eastern wisdom. Like practically it's not something that we grow up. I don't think a lot of people grow up with this idea of self-compassion. It's a skill that many of us can learn later in life, but that idea was just not inherent. And so when I started hearing about that, learning about that, it was like, whoa, okay. It's so deeply healing. And I really am a proponent of teaching people self-compassion in my practice. Because I think it's really a missing link in mental health.
Yeah, very, very powerful. Foundational.
Yeah. You have spoken about emotional constipation in your videos. I love your videos. They're just so insightful and helpful for people. So what is emotional constipation? What does that mean?
So emotional constipation is sort of this concept that that's encapsulated in the phrase "boys don't cry," and it doesn't have to be boys or men, or it can be anyone who's sort of socialized, that crying is taboo. You are not allowed to express sadness, grief, upset. And anyway, boys don't cry is basically the emotional equivalent of saying boys don't poop. So, these are natural human detox processes, pooping, crying, and they are messy. You probably are not kind of wanting like a picture taken of you when you're kind of going through these detox processes, but they are of prime importance. Without that, you don't detox and compost your waste, be it physical or emotional. And when you don't do it on an emotional level, you end up with people who are very emotionally constipated. And often what that means is the grief and the sadness that would have been released with the crying instead gets sort of shunted into often anger or irritability or sometimes anxiety. And that can lead, and if that's compacted over time, it can really lead to violence and lashing out. Yeah. So yeah, it's a conversation I've had over and over again with different patients over the years. And I could just watch the light bulb go off. Some people, and I was actually raised that way. Like I come from, both of my grandfathers were in the military. And so there's a sense of like, don't do that. We're not crying here. Right. And, I know what the effect of that is. It's not healthy.
It's not healthy. Yeah. It has so many downstream effects to hold on to those emotional toxins, like physical effects, emotional, but then like you said, like it carries over into relationships, and then it has a bigger cultural effect as well.
Yeah. And probably physical health as well. Right? Like strokes and heart attacks and, high blood pressure, things like that. And yeah. And it's a whole learning process of like, how do you reverse that? Like once you've really like shut down that capacity, like how do you open enough to be able to feel your sadness again and feel your grief again and feel safe enough to like let that move and let the crying happen? And, because it is a vulnerable process that feels taboo to so many people.
Right. Yeah. So how do you do that? What's a good first step for somebody who's trying to allow that opening to happen?
I'd say slow down And then, especially if you're overreacting or you're getting feedback that you're overreacting, either in an anxious way or an angry way, just kind of like slow down, ask yourself, like, what's actually happening here? Am I sad about something? And then if you have friends who are very like emotionally open and gentle, confiding in somebody who's like really heartfelt, that can really open the gates. Feel really safe with someone. But don't abuse that person. Just tell it. Don't think that just because they're gentle that you can now steamroller over them.
Right.
Respectful, I'm telling you.
Respect the empaths.
That's exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, that slowing down and just breathing and being in your body, helpful. And then getting curious, just asking yourself, okay, what am I feeling? What's going on with me right now?
Sometimes redirecting the energy from up here to the heart. Sometimes putting your hand on your heart, breathing in and out of the heart, like bring the energy down from the problem solving, narrative making, into something that's kind of softer and more embodied.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that practice of hands to heart. And that ties back again to the self-compassion aspect that we were talking about, where like really getting curious with yourself is an act of compassion.
It is. And then you start noticing the ways that you shame yourself. Like you'd be crying and you're apologizing because you're, that's very common.
Yep.
Sorry, like that whole, like, I shouldn't be doing this, and I don't want to shame that because like that's not helpful either, but just like that's a symptom of the blockage.
Yes, that is absolutely a symptom. And I think, we probably both see that a lot with our patients in our practice where, they start crying and then they apologize for it, or they apologize for taking up space for like, oh, well, someone else could have used this appointment, or I don't want to waste your time. And these are all symptoms of that emotional constipation.
Of like, I shouldn't need this, but I do. Usually at that point, when we were meeting in person, I would direct their attention to the tissue box, and just be like, that's here for a reason, only culturally sanctioned place where that can happen, in Western culture, unfortunately, but, wish we had more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so again, for people who are watching this or listening in, these are all skills that can be learned, right? Like you can develop this awareness and this compassion. It's not something that's just innate. Anyone can learn it, and everyone deserves therapy, right? So for anyone who's like, oh, I don't deserve to take up space in therapy, or I don't really need it, everyone can benefit. Maybe I'm biased because
I
work in this field.
But it's like, do you deserve to have a personal trainer?
Right.
It's really that simple. It's just like the emotional and mental equivalent of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. And emotional. So, I mean, one way that I talk about it is in this term, emotional fitness. Like there doesn't have to be anything really quote unquote wrong, or anything necessarily, not even necessarily something specific that you're working on, like, a relationship or something like that. Sometimes therapy can be really helpful just to work on your emotional skills, your regulation, self-exploration, working on your emotional fitness, improving your communication, just becoming more self-aware. There's so many benefits that people can experience from therapy.
Yeah, I definitely feel like everyone should have therapy.
Yes.
Across the board.
Yes.
Actually, people, will be shamed for it. Other people will be like, oh, you see a therapist, like as if you're damaged and but actually I find that the people that I see for therapy are ahead of the curve. Like they're taking things, they're being proactive about self-healing. And so they're causing less problems generally than the people who are like, have a lot of stigma against mental health care.
Yep. That's exactly right. Like there's that idea that the highest functioning person in a family is the one who goes to therapy.
Often the case, right?
Often true. Yeah, often true. And I mean, the good thing is that now there's just much more awareness about mental health.
Mhm.
And I think the pandemic has kind of highlighted that because people who never really thought about it before um, started experiencing, why mental health is such an important aspect of health, of overall health.
Mhm.
I think the conversation is starting to shift. And I see that too with the younger generations, that they're just much more open about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody's talking about, well, my therapist said this.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just so refreshing. But also, once you start to feel better, don't forget to pay it forward to other people who aren't feeling better yet.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Fantastic. Well, thanks, Tracy. Thanks for joining me today. This is so interesting. And I know like we can just keep going on and on, but I think this was really helpful. And, hope for anyone who's listening, if you've been on the fence about therapy or you're just interested in learning more about self-compassion or coping skills or anything like that, I hope this has been helpful. And there's lots of tools and resources out there, and I'll put some of those in the video description under this video. So Tracy, where can people find out more about you?
So the only thing that I have on social media is the little YouTube channel that I started, which is called Visionary Mental Wellness. And it's just little, very short clips of things that, I thought, well, after 20 plus years in practice, do I have anything that might be helpful? And so just started kind of putting those things out. And then just kind of email my website, Yeah.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. So I'll put those links under the video as well. Yeah. Well, thanks again. Thanks so much for joining me.